Karma Entertainment, Rush, Panzer, Tom Clancy, and more. To maximize my chances of securing a contract, I had to prepare pitch materials. If I was going to pitch developing games to a publisher once again, I felt it was necessary to be more than an individual contractor. Contracting was still viable in the video game industry, but now it required a team just to compete. And so I concluded I had to formally found a company and no longer be an individual with a few subcontractors, like I had always done throughout my freelance career. I formed Karma Entertainment as a legal, fictitious business name, FBN, and I obtained a Federal Employer Identification Number, EIN. I investigated incorporation as well, but learned that without more than 3 officers and additional staff, it is legally no more than what is known as an alter ego company, whose precedent is weak. It is easily removed as legal protection. So, being incorporated or a limited liability corporation LLC serve no value for a tiny little group. Aggressive lawyers would simply file an alter ego petition to revert all cases back to the individual founder or founders. Invariably, plaintiff lawyers would succeed at establishing that tiny companies with a few people heading them were typically formed solely to avoid accountability by a few corrupt individuals, and that it was not about affording a large company the protection from distributed decision-making leadership. And so, becoming a formal corporation offered only red tape and bureaucracy without benefits. Therefore, I did not bother with going beyond being a fictitious business name, FBN. Obviously, I abandoned any idea of incorporating, given the expense, operating overhead, liabilities, and getting no protection from it. So once more, I was looking for an opportunity, but this time for Karma Entertainment. Steve Calfee and Bill Hindorf, Vice President and Director of Software Development respectively at Atari Games Consumer Division Tengen, offered me a contract to port, in other words, to translate a game from one platform to another. I was to take San Francisco Rush The Rock Alcatraz edition from the coin-op arcade version, as well as from the consumer Nintendo 64 version. I was to make them run on PCs that ran Windows, supporting 2 major 3D interfaces, Direct3D from Microsoft and 3DFX. I had not programmed the 3DFX chipset before. It was the foundation for the 3D video cards known as Voodoo and Raven of the era. They had all sorts of cool names. Well, there were other 3D video card manufacturers that also used Microsoft's Direct3D interface. And so by supporting D3D, it was like a generic interface to support all sorts of games and platforms on Windows. And so I supported Direct3D. Microsoft ultimately succeeded so well, in fact, with Direct3D that no other 3D API exists to this day in any meaningful way on PCs for games. OpenGL has always remained the only competitor and is a very distant competitor to Microsoft's Direct3D now. I know there are going to be people who will say OpenGL is the better choice. I will just say that some people will argue OpenGL is the true standard, whereas others will say Direct3D is the true standard. I think this is a debate by engineers no different than tabs versus spaces. If you look up on the web, you're going to find out it is nearly a religious, divisive perspective. It is a hot button whether an editor should use tabs or spaces or both. It's silly. It is stupid. Well, anyway, back to the story. San Francisco Rush had performance issues on some computers and some 3DFX video cards. I worked directly with manufacturers like S3 on their Savage 3D video card chipset. I met and worked with 3DFX engineers to optimize the Raven 3DFX chipset over the Voodoo 3DFX chipset. I hired a Direct 3D expert to code the Windows API while I dealt with 3DFX myself. When 3DFX was making progress, I would switch over to help the Windows Direct 3D version. No matter what I did, the Raven 3DFX video card just did not compete in performance with other cards. And yet it was the latest and greatest from 3DFX, but it was slower because it was adapted to support Direct 3D. It was even slower than the native Raven 3DFX. Candidly, I found the Raven 3DFX to be a great concept in tech, but failed in their implementation. It's a lot of techie stuff there. I eventually had an epiphany. I could bypass the write verification step on the graphics processing unit GPU in its first in, first out FIFO register. That would let me push more data into the GPU than waiting for the GPU to acknowledge my write. That would make the Raven slow card competitive. Experimentation proved that it worked well. The game achieved a solid 30 frames per second. I wanted 60 frames per second, but at 30 frames per second, most people cannot tell the difference. Purists will definitely notice, just like audiophiles notice loss even in a compact disc for music. But most people would not know the difference. However, my brilliant idea resulted in curious problems. During the final testing stages of San Francisco Rush The Rock, the test manager asked me, "Do you have any idea why SF Rush fries video cards?" What an odd question, I thought. Of course there is no reason for that, I insisted. But the test manager pointed to a garbage can full of at least several dozen video cards. All were dead and fried. He said something made them stop working. And in every case, it occurred when they were testing San Francisco Rush. Well, I thought it made no sense. But eventually I did find the culprit. It was my speed-up solution where I bypassed that write verification register acknowledgement. It turns out that's kind of like overclocking. I made the devices write so fast that the little teeny gates inside the chip got so hot, they melted and they fused with each other. I learned that things that seem in the moment irrelevant may actually be long-term critically important. In the end, San Francisco Rush The Rock shipped on time, but it could not use the bypass solution, and in some computers might run at 20 frames a second. Later in life, I would take the idea of understanding things in the world around me before I interacted with them as a critical step. I believed that before you extensively used anything, it was important to know how they worked. It was critical to learn controls, threats, and mitigation options before engaging with new things. I wanted immense detail before engaging outside unknown things. I wanted to be in a known safe place before I jumped in. I coined the idea mastering boat controls. Before using anything, you should know how to propel the vehicle, how to steer, how to dock and moor, where all emergency equipment and gear is, and how to use it. The premise was simple. You should know everything about your next steps and actions so that you can plan correctly, and how to mitigate issues as they come up without needing to figure out things in the heat of an emergency. Like I said, I coined that phrase, boat controls, because I formalized the name when renting an outboard powerboat that I had to captain out of a marina around a massive transport ferry and through reefs and rocky, wavy ocean waters. If something happened, I needed to know how to mitigate it. Let's get back to Karma Entertainment. I had to find a contract, and this time I had to find more work. Again. San Francisco Rush was wrapping up. Mindscape and Strategic Simulations Incorporated, SSI, had been acquired by the UK company Pearson Limited. They would now be owned and operated under that company. And they mostly made learning software, but they did make some games. Mindscape and SSI did give me a contract to port Panzer General to the PlayStation, but make it into a 3D game with 3D models and animation. The PlayStation was the first video game console to have full, native 3D accelerated hardware, other than Super Nintendo's Mode 7, which was more of a matrix transformed 2D bitmap. It was not real 3D at all. By the way, previously I wrote Super Nintendo or SNES Mode 7 features in games, so I had intimate knowledge of it. I also wrote Dick Vitale Awesome Baby Basketball for the Sega Genesis, which had to emulate the SNES Mode 7 capabilities, and that was insanely hard to do on a Sega Genesis. It garnered lots of press because people were shocked at how a Sega Genesis was delivering 3D scaled rotating graphics where no other game ever had before. Well, I could do it because I was a genius. Well, on San Francisco Rush for Atari Games, I only had to fix bugs and polish San Francisco Rush on Windows using 3DFX and Direct3D chipsets while I was starting Panzer General. To scale, I decided I needed to hire more people. I hired a PlayStation and 3D experienced programmer named Franz. He was to work on Panzer in parallel to my finishing Rush. Well, this guy Franz sucked. He turned out to be super secretive. Whenever we came by his home, he would hide behind a barely open door. We all worked remotely in our homes as virtual entities, so it was normal just to use phone calls. But when we went to him, he would not let us in. Franz failed to deliver on a single milestone. He made no billable progress. I ended up working 110-hour work weeks for nearly 6 weeks. It was killing me just to compensate for his failure. It was too much. It was the first and only time in my life that I let a contract get canceled. I told SSI that I was sorry, but their expectations could not be achieved with the engineer that I hired, and unless they were prepared to extend the time, the game had to die. They agreed and said it was speculative anyway. Pearson was not excited about games, and to smooth things out, they figured canceling it might make it more palatable to Pearson. Panzer 3D was not going smoothly anyway. They concluded along with me that Panzer General 3D should be canceled. It was a tragic reminder, once again, for me, that whenever I truly relied on and trusted people with important, critical things, they most often would hurt me. Panzer suffered because I trusted the 3D engineer to do the work that he promised and that he committed to do in a contract. However, he withdrew and became secretive. Our best guess, he was using illicit drugs. For what and why? None of it mattered. People that interview and present well may still be nasty, untrustworthy losers, and they may well betray you, or at least let you down.